Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host Vikas Swarup. 30 years ago, a defining event of the 20th century took place. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved, marking the end of the once mighty communist empire which spanned Eastern, Southern and Northern Europe and Central and Northern Asia for 70 years. If one has to pick a specific date, then it was December 25, 1991, when the Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, that had flown above the Kremlin for over 70 years was replaced by the Russian white, blue and red, and the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, handed over the nuclear button to the first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin. The disappearance of the Soviet Union was an international shock because the USSR was the largest country in the world, spanning 12 time zones and making up nearly 1/7 of the Earth's land surface. At its peak, it was also an industrial powerhouse, an economic rival to the United States with a huge manufacturing capacity and global influence as the bastion of communism. However, within the giant nation were 15 dramatically different republics, dozens of ethnicities, languages and cultures. Soviet satellite states began to drift from the USSR's orbit in the 1980s as the Soviet economy began to fail and the Soviet military got bogged down in Afghanistan. When Mikhail Gorbachev became head of the Communist Party in 1985, he sensed these winds of change and sought to revamp the country's economy and government. He introduced perestroika, or economic restructuring, in an attempt to kickstart the stagnant economy and began mending relationships with Western European countries and the United States. Gorbachev also launched glasnost, or openness, as the second vital plank of his reform efforts. He dismantled the secret police, believing that the opening up of the political system, essentially democratizing it, was the only way to open the door to new ideas. But even perestroika and glasnost could not overcome the structural weaknesses of the socialist economic model. In November of 1988, Estonia became the first Soviet republic to declare state sovereignty from Moscow. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, the most tangible representation of the so-called Iron Curtain in Europe, leading East and West Germany to officially reunite within a year, ending the Cold War. Once the Berlin Wall fell, citizens in Eastern European countries such as Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria and Romania staged protests against their pro-Soviet governments, hastening the collapse of communist regimes across the former Soviet bloc. On March 11, 1990, Lithuania became the first republic to officially break away from the USSR, declaring its independence. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of three of the Union's founding and largest republics, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, signed the Commonwealth of Independent States Creation Agreement, declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed and recognizing each other's independence. They were quickly followed by the other republics. By Christmas Day 1991, all that was left was a significantly smaller Russia, with 3/4 of the USSR's territory and half its population. The remainder was subsumed in the 14 independent states of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine and Uzbekistan. When the end came, it took only months for the USSR to unravel, and it was largely peaceful. But to a world indoctrinated by the binary logic of the Cold War, it still came as a surprise. And the ramifications of that event are still reverberating as we see tensions rising on Russia's border with Ukraine. So to discuss the factors which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and its impact on India and the world, I have with me two distinguished experts who need no introduction. To give us the political perspective is Mr. Madhav, politician, author and thinker, who is the former National General Secretary of the Bharatiya Janata Party. He is a member of the Board of Governors of India Foundation and has over 200 publications to his credit. And to give us the diplomatic perspective is Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, a career diplomat with over 40 years of experience who served as ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France and Russia and retired as Foreign Secretary. A prolific commentator on national and international affairs, he has written more than 550 op-eds for Indian and international media. A very warm welcome to both my panelists. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Sibal. Russian President Vladimir Putin has called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But why did it happen, and was it inevitable?
Well, I think he was right in describing this. After all, the Soviet Union was the biggest country in the world, and it collapsed. A superpower collapsed. And now, from a superpower, Russia is being treated as a regional power, and at times rather contemptuously, and has been subject to repeated sanctions, political, economic, and otherwise. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, new countries emerged on the Russian border, which created new political, economic, and security issues. NATO expanded relentlessly. Even traditional friendly countries like Bulgaria joined NATO. Central Asia became independent, which gave China all the space to intrude into Soviet space, which made the BRI possible. Without that, you wouldn't have had at least the land-based BRI. Russia tried to preserve its space through the CIS, CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Union. But in other areas, the disarmament structures collapsed because of Russia's weakness. The United States walked out of the ABM treaty, and now recently they walked out of the INF too. Now, why it collapsed is because the Soviet Union became dysfunctional both politically and economically. Its economy began to stagnate, and they had no tools available to them to actually revive the economy unless they went in for major economic reforms. Similarly, in terms of the political stalemate in the country caused by the economic decline, there was no solution unless they reformed the politics of it. Hence, this whole policy of perestroika and glasnost, which became the focal point of rivalry between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Gorbachev wanted to remain the president of the Soviet Union, and Yeltsin wanted to be the president of Russia. Now, the Communist Party was holding the country together, but since there was this division in the Communist Party, the whole structure, political structure, collapsed. And as it happens in Russia, which is remarkable, the Russian army is not Napoleonic in its temperament. They could have saved the country from collapse, but they kept a neutral position. But the glue was not democracy; it was the Communist Party, ideology-based Communist Party, and the constituent countries of the Soviet Union were part of the Soviet Union by consent, in accordance with the Soviet Constitution. This was this great liberalism in a different sense. So once the country collapsed, legally the constituent states could seek independence, and in fact, Yeltsin told them, take as much independence as you can. And this is what Putin described as a time bomb that was put in the Soviet Constitution because of this provision, which could allow legally the constituent states to win. And hence the Soviet Union collapsed.
Mr. Madhav, many international experts have suggested that the Soviet Union could have staggered on for a further decade, were it not for Gorbachev, who both unleashed radical reforms and provoked strong opposition to those changes. He was the trigger that brought about the collapse of the Union, and he remains a contentious and polarizing figure within Russia. How important, according to you, was the role of Gorbachev in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and how do you evaluate his legacy?
Undoubtedly, Gorbachev's role was the trigger for whatever happened in the Soviet Union through the 1980s, which had ultimately resulted in the dissolution of the erstwhile USSR and independent states emerging out of it. I think that Gorbachev was very clear about one thing, that was the political reform. But I give a benefit of doubt to him as to whether he really wanted Soviet Union to collapse. Because as Ambassador Sibal also pointed out, until the end, he was trying his best to save the Union from complete dissolution, complete collapse. But he was very committed to the idea of bringing in political reforms. That is where we all should give full credit to Gorbachev. Not just in Soviet Union, we must remember, when the question of the unification of Germany came up 2 years before the ultimate collapse of Soviet Union in 1989, Gorbachev tacitly supported the unification. He did not actually openly come out in opposition of the unification proposal. Very surprisingly, Margaret Thatcher was opposed to it. Helmut Kohl was opposed to it, but not Gorbachev. So Gorbachev was probably in favor of political reform, more openness, electoral process, democratic processes to be introduced to Soviet system. He was in that favor, so that's why he wanted the elections to happen freely and fairly in a multi-party system in Soviet Union also. So his perestroika and glasnost were genuine reforms that he wanted to introduce in USSR. Whether he was prepared for the ultimate consequence of it, I have my own doubts. Boris Yeltsin's revolt in 1991, we all know probably that at one point the hardliners in the Communist Party, Soviet Communist Party, had taken over the control of the government in August 1991 through a coup. That coup did not fail because of Gorbachev. That coup failed because of Yeltsin. Yeltsin mobilized people and captured White House, the Duma, the Russian Parliament, and that is when he gave a call to, as Ambassador Sibal pointed out, the army. He gave a call to the army not to obey the orders of the new coup leaders. So, actual final trigger for dismemberment of Soviet Union, also the responsibility lies on Yeltsin also. Having said it, this was bound to happen. One of the reasons was pointed out by Ambassador Sibal, the economic stagnation that was actually troubling many parts of the Soviet Union, but also the political atmosphere that had very quickly changed in entire Europe. So slowly the Eastern European countries were moving away from the communist regime and they were opting for a different, probably more open system. That, together with the two reforms of Gorbachev, perestroika and glasnost, had finally led to a consequence which probably Gorbachev did not want. But the final nail in the coffin was hit by Boris Yeltsin through his popular revolt.
Ambassador Sibal, how did the breakup of the Soviet Union impact the global power structure that emerged after the Second World War?
Well, first of all, the obvious one, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism as an ideology, which then opened up so many options for other countries to establish new relationships and new equations. So that point of view, one important consequence was that the non-aligned movement lost its relevance. And from there on, you see how the non-aligned movement has become largely moribund. Russia was pushed back from Europe progressively with the expansion both of NATO and the European Union. I mentioned already that the disarmament structure had collapsed. Very importantly, we had this phase of unilateralism, US unilateralism that began, with the US then engaging in regime changes in various areas which were sensitive geopolitically for Russia, the Middle East or West Asia, obviously, but much more importantly in the periphery of Russia itself. Yugoslavia was broken up because of the weakening of Russian power. And of course, all this opened up space with the weakening of Russia for China to expand.
Mr. Madhav, India was also influenced by the Soviet Union, particularly in the first few decades after independence. India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru helped shape an economy that was substantially modeled on the Soviet template. 5-year plans, central planning, and a dominant public sector that would assume the commanding heights of the economy. So what impact did the demise of the Soviet Union have on India?
Ambassador Swarup, it is true that Nehru's fascination for the Soviet model was not hidden because he himself had spoken about it. But one thing that I must mention here, that sometimes, many in my party or my school of thought think that Nehru became a communist. Nehru never became a communist. Very interestingly, in 1936, he very openly condemns, criticizes, and negates communism. He says communism is not a good idea, very bad idea. But he did opt for certain Soviet-era economic, institutions or systems, like, as you mentioned, 5-year plans, etc. It can be, an academic discussion today to criticize them. But during that period of the initial years of our independence, that model had actually helped India develop certain basic institutions here. For example, the big dams that came into being at that time through government's initiatives. Similarly, the major public sector industry that came in when we had no capacity to encourage private sector initially. So some of those things were the result of Soviet model planning that we adopted. But you also know that by the time Soviet Union had collapsed, we had already discarded that path of socialism. That was the time when we had Manmohan Singh, P.V. Narasimha duo running the affairs of our country. We had already shifted gears. As far as the relationship is concerned, we all know that that relationship was not just about certain plans being adopted or aped by us. It was much bigger than that. We too had worked together in many areas, including defense. Strategic relationship evolved between our two countries. Incidentally, that relationship continues even to this day.
Ambassador Sibal, the countries which were part of the USSR remain important for Russia for a number of obvious reasons. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia has asserted a special relationship, special interests, and special rights in these countries. This also led to Russian military actions in Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. How do you see the relationship between Russia and the former Soviet republics evolving in the near future?
First of all, I think it's natural for Russia to seek a special relationship and also try and preserve its special interests in states that were earlier part of the Soviet Union. After all, when we want to ourselves say that we have special interests and special relationship with our neighbors, but they were never a part of independent India. So it's quite normal, I think, for Russia. With regard to wanting to exert special rights, of that I'm not sure, because these are now sovereign states, and you cannot abridge their sovereignty in the belief that you have special rights. It has to be dealt with through consent. If they want to be part of certain formations where they can mutually benefit from each other, that's fine. So that part I don't know. I think the small countries would continue to be very wary of Russia. The other thing that one must keep in mind is that 45 million Russians were, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, left outside the borders of Russia. And it is legitimate for Russia to try and protect those ethnic communities and their language. And we have seen that those rights are being denied to the Russian-speaking and Russian ethnic communities. This is a fact which can't be challenged. In fact, there have been serious provocations in the Baltic states, especially, and now in Ukraine, against Russian ethnic groups and the Russian language. The World War II discourse, what happened in World War II and the manner in which Russia sacrificed and won the Second World War, that discourse has been deliberately changed. And in fact, now countries are saying that they suffered far more under the Soviet Union than they suffered from the Nazi attacks. This is the extent to which history is being revised. In Georgia, the West certainly was clearly provoking Russia, and Russia declared a red line and forced Russia to intervene. But this red line was not observed, was not registered. And now you see the same kind of things happening in Ukraine, which already has paid some territorial price for challenging Russia's legitimate interests. Now, much more importantly, the Central Asian countries are now in the grip of China economically.
Economically, yes.
But of course, still depend on Russia for security. Therefore, the Central Asian countries, unlike Ukraine, Georgia, and the West and Europe, these countries are playing a different game, and they are both recognizing the importance of the relationship with Russia, as also not to come once again under Russian domination and use China, on whom they have become more and more economically dependent. This is true of all of them, apart from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. The Central Asian migrants into Russia are contribute immensely to the economies of the Central Asian countries. So this is a vital tool in the hands of Russia to exert influence on them.
Madhavji, the Marxist state collapsed in Soviet Union despite its impressive technological successes. But in neighboring China, the Chinese Communist Party managed to survive despite the largest famine in human history, mass protests and massacres. In fact, the contrast between the Soviet Union in its dying days and modern China could not be more stark. So what lessons did China learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what did it do to avoid a similar fate?
From Khrushchev's time onwards, USSR and China did not enjoy great relationship. China moved more closer to America in 80s than probably with an ideological friend like USSR. But to give him his due, Gorbachev did try to improve relations with China. But China very closely watched the happenings in Soviet Union. In fact, you will find a lot of observations about the Soviet developments in Chinese literature. What Deng used to say about them, then subsequently what Jiang Zemin had said about those things and all those things, they're available. Now, what the Chinese leadership had realized was that what we should offer to the people first was economic freedom, not necessarily political freedom. That's the important lesson that they drew from the Soviet collapse. What happened in Soviet Union was that they tried to give political freedoms before giving people enough economic freedom, economic prosperity. And today, having emerged as a strong economic power, they are attempting at dethroning America and Western powers from the dominant technological position also. Today in space, in other technology areas like frontier areas like artificial intelligence, in all these areas, the Chinese are racing ahead. In some areas, they are way ahead of America also. But before that, they ensured that their economic situation will be much better.
Ambassador Sibal, the demise of the Soviet Union was accompanied by the hope that a new, inclusive and cooperative world order would be built after the USSR and Western countries mutually put an end to the Cold War. Yet today we see a marked deterioration in Russia's ties with the West. It has been argued that the collapse of the Soviet Union offered a second missed opportunity to reintegrate Russia into Europe. Where did the West or Russia go wrong, and how do you see the prospects of a reconciliation between Russia and the West?
One important point I'd like to make, that the creation of a new inclusive world order didn't depend on the end of the Cold War and the Soviet US West confrontation. After all, we are part of the world, the India and the developing countries, and an inclusive world order means the reform of the United Nations, reform of the UN Security Council. All the pressures that are being built on the developing countries as a result of the domination of the West, economically and technologically, and the sanctions and everything else, were actually applied to the rest of the world, including India. Therefore, an inclusive world, to my mind, goes far beyond the end of the Cold War. That's one. The other is that it is definitely, to my mind, primarily a big political and geopolitical failure of the West. Instead of integrating Russia into a new European security architecture, the United States and, of course, some European countries, especially the Baltic states and Poland and Hungary, the former Warsaw Pact countries, they took advantage of a weak Russia to expand NATO and keep possibly resurgent Russia in in a strategically inferior situation in Europe. And the other point, of course, was that by extending NATO and everything else to quell any thoughts about strategic autonomy for Europe, because otherwise, and that was the reason why the United States especially would not let Europe and Russia reconcile. This, quite apart from certain elements in Europe itself, which were not favorable, is because NATO would have become more and more irrelevant, and the US's grip over Europe would have got loosened. And once the transatlantic unity got disturbed like this, the US global power would have been affected. I don't think there was any need to include Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. If Sweden and Finland could remain out of NATO during the Cold War, when the threat from the Soviet Union was felt in a far more palpable way than today, and they remained outside the NATO even after the Soviet Union collapsed, I can't see any immediate scenario of any reconciliation, because the relationship with Russia has become a very toxic part of US domestic politics, as well as in Europe itself. The biggest geopolitical mistake that that has been committed is that the focus has shifted away from China. The funny part is, the sad part is rather, that United States is now involved in tensions and potential conflict at both ends of the Eurasian continent.
What lessons does the collapse of the Soviet Union hold for the world?
USSR was a totally artificial creation, a kind of annexation of many independent nationalities, and that was bound to collapse. Such a model can never be sustained. A common national sentiment urge develops through millennia of national experiences, cohabitation, co-living, through which a common culture develops and all that. USSR was just an opposite example of it, trying to usurp the national identities of a number of different nations and trying to create an artificial nation. A government's primary duty is to make the life of its citizens happy. So economic welfare, social welfare should be the primary occupation of the governments. But in Soviet Union, we saw it was not the primary occupation of the government. The primary occupation was to compete with America, reach the space before them, do everything before them. And finally, you cannot have authoritarian, dictatorial regimes forever. You cannot curb the fundamental rights, aspirations of the people forever.
Ambassador Sibal?
Well, I wouldn't like to disagree with Madhav on some of the points he made, because Russia has not oppressed its minorities. You have Tatarstan in Russia. You have Buddhist states in Russia, Kalmyka and others. They accept subnationalities. In fact, we don't accept the kind of subnationalism that Russia accepts. The only problem is in Chechnya and the Caucasus, which is old history, and I don't want to go into this. I don't think that really is the core of the problem. And if the same yardsticks were to be applied, then we should look forward to the collapse of China at some stage. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the lesson to be learned is that internal strength and cohesion are very necessary for survival, and not your military capacities which can defend you against external aggression. After all, Russia, even today, is one of the two foremost nuclear powers. And in the Soviet times, it had formidable military capacities, but it just collapsed. It collapsed because of the nature of its constitution, nature of its ideology, the over-centralized regime, lack of economic progress. In other words, the highly centralized systems are inherently fragile, especially in very large countries. And then rigid ideologies do not allow to follow pragmatic policies, adjust to changing situations, because there are certain first principles on which the country and state is based, and departing from them raises the spectacle that the whole system may begin to have fissures and break down.
Let me thank both my panelists for this outstanding discussion. Francis Fukuyama had famously proclaimed the demise of communism and the end of the Cold War as the end of history. But 30 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we are still dealing with its aftermath. What is important, as Ram Madhavji pointed out, is that India has retained its special and privileged relationship with Russia while also developing close ties with the former Soviet republics. That is all in this week's episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, good evening and goodbye.